The rain had started as a drizzle but quickly turned into a steady downpour, soaking through Brandon's thin jacket as he hurried down the sidewalk. His 6-year-old daughter, Lily, clung to his hand, her small fingers cold in his grasp. He wished he could afford a better raincoat for her, but right now, every dollar went toward keeping a roof over their heads and food on the table. "Daddy, I'm wet," Lily whined, trying to pull her hood further over her head. "I know, sweetheart. We're almost home," Brandon assured her, though the leaky apartment they rented wasn't much of a refuge from the cold. His job at the auto repair shop barely covered their expenses, and with rent overdue, the landlord had already given him a warning. As they turned a corner near the small grocery store, a boy, no older than 8, stood alone under the awning, shivering. He wore expensive-looking clothes, his jacket was thick, his shoes spotless, but his face was pale with fear. His blonde hair was plastered to his forehead from the rain, and his wide blue eyes darted around anxiously. Brandon slowed down, glancing around for an adult. The boy didn't belong here. The neighborhood was mostly filled with working-class families, and this kid's clothes screamed wealth. Lily noticed him too. "Daddy, why is he alone?" Brandon sighed, squeezing her hand. He didn't have time for this. He was exhausted, cold, and the last thing he needed was to get involved in someone else's problem. But leaving a child alone in the rain didn't sit right with him. He approached carefully. "Hey, buddy, are you lost?" The boy flinched but nodded. "I don't know where my driver is. He was supposed to pick me up." His voice wavered, and he sniffled loudly. Brandon frowned. "A driver? Yeah, this kid was definitely from money." "Did you call your parents?" "I don't have a phone," the boy admitted, his lower lip trembling. Brandon glanced around again. No one else seemed to notice or care. He sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "All right, let's get you out of the rain first." Lily smiled at the boy, her natural kindness shining through. "You can come with us." The boy hesitated, but then nodded quickly, as if realizing he had no other option. Brandon led them to a nearby cafe, one of the cheapest places in town. It wasn't anything fancy, but at least it was warm and dry. He ushered the kids inside and found a table near the corner. The boy sat down, still looking nervous. "What's your name?" Brandon asked as he waved over a waitress. "Oliver," the boy said quietly. Brandon nodded. "Okay, Oliver, we'll figure out how to get you home. Do you know your address?" Oliver hesitated, then shook his head. "I just moved here. My dad's always busy and the driver picks me up after school, but today, he didn't come." Brandon sighed. That complicated things. The waitress came over, and Brandon quickly calculated how much he could spare. "2 hot chocolates, please." He glanced at Oliver and, after a moment of hesitation, added, "And 1 for him too." The waitress nodded and left. Lily leaned toward Oliver. "Don't worry, my daddy will help you." Brandon smiled at his daughter's confidence in him. He wished he had that same faith in himself. The drinks arrived, and Oliver wrapped his hands around the warm cup, looking grateful. "Thank you," he murmured. Brandon nodded. "We'll figure this out. Do you remember your dad's phone number?" Oliver hesitated before shaking his head again. Brandon exhaled slowly. This was getting more complicated by the minute. As they sat there, trying to think of a plan, the cafe door swung open. A tall man in a suit rushed in, his face pale with worry. His sharp eyes scanned the room until they landed on Oliver. "Oliver." The boy turned, his eyes widening. "Dad." The man strode over and pulled Oliver into a tight hug. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Brandon watched the scene unfold, realizing this wasn't just any worried father. The man's tailored suit, expensive watch, and the way the cafe staff seemed to recognize him immediately told Brandon everything he needed to know. This man was wealthy beyond wealthy. Oliver's father turned to Brandon, his expression shifting from relief to curiosity. "You found my son." Brandon nodded. He was alone in the rain, said his driver never showed up. The man's jaw tightened. "That driver won't be working for me anymore." He turned back to Brandon. "Thank you, truly." Brandon shrugged. Anyone would have done the same. The man studied him. "No, not everyone would stop, you did." Brandon didn't know what to say to that. Oliver looked up at his father. "Dad, this is Brandon and Lily. They helped me." His father nodded. "I'm Adrian Whitmore." He extended a hand. Brandon shook it, feeling the strength in the man's grip. The name sounded familiar. And then it hit him: Adrian Whitmore, the billionaire investor. Brandon swallowed hard. He had just helped a billionaire's son. Adrian turned to Oliver. "Let's get you home." Oliver hesitated. "Can we say goodbye to them first?" Adrian nodded. Oliver turned to Lily. "Thank you for sharing your hot chocolate with me." Lily grinned. "You're welcome. Maybe we can play sometime." Oliver smiled. Adrian glanced at Brandon. "I owe you." Brandon shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." Adrian gave him a long look but didn't argue. Instead, he placed a card on the table. "If you ever need anything, call me." Brandon wasn't sure he ever would, but he nodded. As Adrian and Oliver left, Lily tugged on Brandon's sleeve. "Daddy, do you think we'll see them again?" Brandon looked at the card on the table and slipped it into his pocket. "Maybe," he said. Brandon didn't think much about the encounter after Oliver and his father left the cafe. He had more pressing matters to worry about: rent, groceries, and keeping Lily warm as the weather turned colder. The card Adrian Whitmore had given him sat untouched on the small table in their apartment, but Brandon figured men like that handed out cards all the time without expecting anyone to actually use them. A few days later, he was at the auto shop, working on a sedan with a persistent engine problem. His hands were covered in oil, and his back ached from bending over the hood for hours. The shop barely paid enough to cover his bills, but right now, it was the only steady work he had. Brandon, his boss, Rick, called from the front of the shop. "Someone's here to see you." Brandon wiped his hands on a rag and walked out, expecting a customer complaint or maybe a parts delivery. Instead, he found himself face to face with Adrian Whitmore. The billionaire stood in the shop's waiting area, looking completely out of place in his tailored coat and polished shoes. Brandon straightened, caught off guard. "Mr. Whitmore." Adrian nodded. "I was in the area, thought I'd stop by." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "In the area?" A slight smile touched Adrian's lips. "All right, I looked you up." Brandon tensed. "Why?" Adrian studied him for a moment. "Because I wanted to know more about the man who helped my son when he had no reason to." Brandon shrugged. It wasn't a big deal. Adrian's gaze sharpened. It was to Oliver. Brandon didn't know what to say to that, so he waited. After a short pause, Adrian glanced around the shop. "You've been working here long?" Brandon hesitated. "A few years." Adrian nodded, then gestured toward the sedan Brandon had been working on. "You any good?" Brandon frowned at the question. "I get the job done." Adrian seemed to consider something before speaking again. "I have a collection of cars classics, modern imports, everything in between. My usual mechanic retired recently, and I've been looking for someone reliable." Brandon's brow furrowed as he processed the words. "Are you offering me a job?" Adrian lifted a shoulder. "I'm asking if you'd be interested in one." Brandon's instinct was to refuse. He didn't know much about billionaires, but he imagined working for one came with a whole different set of problems. And yet, the thought of a better-paying job, one that might give him a little breathing room, was tempting. Still, he was cautious. "Why me?" Adrian didn't hesitate. Because you didn't ask for anything when you helped Oliver. That tells me enough about the kind of person you are. Brandon rubbed the back of his neck. I've never worked on luxury cars before. You're a mechanic, you can learn. Brandon exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure what to think. He needed the money, but this felt too sudden, too unreal. Think about it, Adrian said, pulling a business card from his pocket and handing it over. That's my direct line. If you're interested, call me. Brandon stared at the card for a moment before nodding. I'll think about it. Adrian studied him briefly, then gave a small nod before turning to leave. Brandon stood there for a long moment, turning the card over in his fingers. Rick walked up beside him, arms crossed. That looked important. Brandon let out a breath. Yeah, I think it was. That night, after putting Lily to bed, Brandon sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the business card. He had never been the type to take risks, especially when he had a child to care for. But this job offer, it could change everything. Still, the doubt lingered. What if he wasn't good enough? What if this was some rich man's impulsive decision that he'd later take back? Brandon sighed, leaning back in his chair. He had no idea what to do. Brandon sat in his dimly lit kitchen, the business card still in his hand. He had spent the past few days thinking about Adrian Whitmore's offer, running through every possible outcome in his mind. A job working on luxury cars sounded like a dream compared to what he had now, but dreams didn't always work out. He had responsibilities, and he couldn't afford to gamble with his daughter's future. Still, the thought of better pay, of finally catching up on rent, of not having to count every dollar at the grocery store, it gnawed at him. After another long night of tossing and turning, he finally picked up his phone and dialed the number. The call was answered almost immediately. Brandon kept his voice steady as he spoke. He asked about the details of the job, the expectations, the hours. Adrian explained everything clearly. He needed someone reliable to maintain and repair his collection of cars, from vintage classics to modern imports. The pay was more than double what Brandon was making now. I can't promise I'll be perfect at it, Brandon admitted. You wouldn't have called if you didn't think you could handle it, Adrian replied. Brandon exhaled slowly. There was no backing out now. The next morning, he gave his notice at the auto shop. Rick didn't seem surprised. I figured you'd take that job, he said, wiping grease from his hands. You're good, Brandon. You deserve better than this place. Brandon appreciated the words, even if part of him still felt like he was stepping into something he wasn't ready for. A few days later, he arrived at Adrian's private garage. The place was unlike anything he had ever seen, sleek, spotless, filled with cars that cost more than he could ever imagine earning in a lifetime. He was introduced to the staff who managed the estate, though Adrian made it clear that Brandon would mostly be working alone. The first few weeks were overwhelming. The cars were different from anything he had worked on before, with technology and precision that required a steep learning curve. But he adapted, spending extra hours studying manuals, watching videos, and learning everything he could. He kept his head down and focused on the work, but he couldn't ignore the drastic shift in his life. For the first time in years, he wasn't constantly panicking about money. He was able to buy Lily a proper winter coat. He paid off the overdue rent. He even started saving a little, something he hadn't been able to do in a long time. Then, one evening, as he was finishing up a tune-up on one of Adrian's classic cars, Oliver appeared in the garage. Brandon glanced up. Hey, kid. Oliver grinned. I wanted to see what you do here. Brandon wiped his hands on a rag. It's mostly fixing things and making sure they run right. Oliver walked around the car, his eyes wide with curiosity. Can you teach me? Brandon blinked. You want to learn about cars? Oliver nodded enthusiastically. Brandon hesitated. He wasn't sure if Adrian would approve of his son hanging around the garage, but when Oliver looked up at him with that eager expression, he found himself nodding. "All right," he said, "but you have to listen, no messing around." Oliver grinned, "I promise." Over the next few weeks, Oliver started visiting the garage more often. Brandon showed him the basics: how to check oil levels, what different tools were for, how engines worked. The kid asked a million questions, soaking up everything Brandon told him. One evening, as Brandon was locking up, Adrian walked in. "I hear you've been teaching Oliver about cars," he said. Brandon straightened, unsure if Adrian was upset. "Yeah, he seems interested." Adrian nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "That's good for him." Brandon relaxed slightly. Adrian studied him for a moment before speaking again. "Has this job been working out for you?" Brandon nodded. "Yeah, it's been life-changing, honestly." Adrian seemed to consider something, then said, "I have a proposition for you." Brandon tensed. "What kind of proposition?" Adrian took a step closer. "I'm expanding my collection. I need someone to oversee the entire operation: repairs, acquisitions, maintenance. It's a bigger role with a bigger paycheck." Brandon's breath caught. "You don't have to answer now," Adrian said. "Think about it." Brandon could only nod, his mind already racing. Brandon sat in his small apartment that evening, rubbing his hands together as he tried to process everything. The idea of overseeing Adrian's entire car collection was overwhelming. It was more than just a job, it was a huge responsibility, something he had never imagined for himself. He had spent years just trying to survive, doing whatever work he could find to keep food on the table for Lily. Now, he was being offered something stable, something that could actually build a future. But with that opportunity came doubt. Could he handle it? Was Adrian really willing to trust him with something so significant? He had only been working in the garage for a few months. Maybe this was just another one of those things rich people did, offering opportunities on a whim, only to change their minds later. Lily's soft breathing filled the quiet space as she slept on the pull-out couch. Brandon had given up the bedroom for her, wanting her to have at least a little comfort in their cramped living situation. The next day, he returned to Adrian's estate, still mulling over the offer. When he arrived at the garage, Adrian was already there, standing near one of the classic cars with a serious expression. Brandon hesitated before stepping forward. "I've been thinking about what you said." Adrian turned, waiting. Brandon took a deep breath. "I want to do it, but I need to know you're sure about this. You barely know me." Adrian studied him for a moment before replying, "I know enough." Brandon wasn't sure what that meant, but before he could ask, Adrian pulled something from his coat pocket and handed it over. Brandon looked down and froze. "A check." "A check for $10,000. His chest tightened. "What is this?" Adrian's voice was steady. "For what you did that night, you didn't have to stop. You didn't have to take Oliver in, buy him something warm, make sure he was safe. But you did." Brandon swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the paper. "I didn't do it for money." "I know," Adrian said. "That's why you deserve it." Brandon hesitated, his instincts screaming to refuse. But then he thought of Lily. He thought of the bills piling up, the constant stress of trying to stretch every dollar. This money, it could change everything. He exhaled slowly, nodding. "Thank you." Adrian gave a simple nod in return, then gestured toward the car behind him. "Now, let's talk about your new role." Brandon took a steadying breath. The weight of survival that had pressed on his shoulders for years suddenly felt a little lighter. Brandon adjusted to his new role faster than he expected. The transition from working on everyday cars to managing an entire collection of high-end vehicles was overwhelming at first. But he approached it with the same determination that had kept him going through years of struggle. He spent long hours familiarizing himself with each car, learning the specific maintenance requirements, and coordinating the necessary repairs. Adrian didn't hover, but he did check in from time to time, offering insights on acquisitions and the history behind certain models. Brandon appreciated the trust Adrian placed in him, and over time, his confidence in his own abilities grew. Lily adjusted well too. With the higher salary, Brandon was able to move them into a better apartment, one with a real bedroom for her and a kitchen that didn't feel like it belonged in a storage closet. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was safe, warm, and most importantly, stable. One evening, as Brandon was finishing up in the garage, Oliver showed up again, his eyes full of excitement. The boy had kept his promise to take an interest in cars, often watching Brandon work and asking endless questions. This time, however, he was holding something behind his back. Brandon wiped his hands on a rag. "You look like you've got something to say." Oliver grinned and pulled out a small, hand-drawn picture. It was a crayon drawing of a sleek sports car, with Brandon's name written underneath it in uneven letters. "I designed this," Oliver said proudly. "It's not a real car, but I thought maybe one day you could build one like it." Brandon took the paper, studying the details. The lines were rough, but Oliver had put thought into it. He had even labeled different parts, just like he'd seen Brandon do when working on repairs. Brandon knelt so they were at eye level. "This is pretty good, kid. You've got an eye for design." Oliver beamed. "Do you think could learn how to build cars someday?" Brandon nodded. "If you want to, yes. It takes a lot of work, but I think you'd be good at it." Oliver's excitement was evident. He grabbed one of the nearby tools and held it up. "Can you teach me more?" Brandon chuckled. "All right, but just the basics for now. Your dad might not be thrilled if you start taking apart his cars." Oliver laughed, and they spent the next hour going over simple mechanics. Brandon showed him how to check tire pressure, how to recognize certain engine parts, and even let him tighten a few bolts under supervision. As the days passed, Brandon found himself settling into a life he never thought possible. He no longer had to worry about every dollar. He wasn't constantly exhausted from stress. For the first time in years, he could plan for the future rather than just survive the present. He had spent too many years scraping by, too many nights wondering how he would make it to the next paycheck. But now, things were different. When he got home, Lily was waiting for him, curled up with a book. She looked up as he walked in. "Did you have a good day, Daddy?" Brandon smiled, ruffling her hair. "Yeah, sweetheart. I think things are finally looking up." And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it.